the SUV slammed into us at 60 miles an hour. Glass shattered, metal screamed, and my laptop became my only weapon. Now I'm holding a key card with a medical logo, and the man who tried to drag me from the wreckage is still out there. My name is Sarah Johnson, and I just found out I'm genetically identical to a woman who died in 1890. The people chasing me? They're not after my past. They're after what's inside me. And my only lead is a weeping uncle who says I'm the key to breaking a curse. The road is blocked. The woods are watching. And whatever they want from me, they're willing to kill for it. The rain drummed a frantic, uneven rhythm against the rental car's roof, smelling of damp upholstery and the bitter, burnt scent of stale Starbucks coffee. Sarah Johnson squinted against the harsh, blue-white glare of her tablet, her eyes tracking a jagged sequence of DNA markers that pulsed on the screen like a digital heartbeat. It was a thumbprint, a biological signature screaming a perfect match across a century of silence. She shifted a heavy, yellowed archival map across her lap, the ancient parchment crackling like dried skin under her touch. Her finger, trembling slightly, traced the ink-stained boundary of the Maine woods, following a hand-drawn line to a secluded, dark blotch labeled Vance. The coordinates aligned with terrifying precision. The ancient ink met the modern code in a perfect intersection that made the hair on her arms stand up. This patch of wilderness, cold and indifferent, held her blood in its soil. She wasn't just a tourist or a researcher. She was a variable in a long dormant equation. A sharp rap on the window made her pulse jump. Mark Miller stood in the downpour, his flannel shirt clinging to his broad shoulders, soaked to the bone. He jerked his chin toward the dense, suffocating wall of pine trees that swallowed the road ahead. "Ready?" he shouted over the howling wind. Sarah shoved the tablet into her bag, the zipper snagging on a loose thread with a harsh scritch. She stepped out of the car, her boots immediately sinking into the sucking, freezing mud. The air tasted of wet pine needles and the faint, underlying scent of rot. "Keep close," Mark muttered, his voice low as he pushed aside a heavy hemlock branch. The forest floor muffled their footsteps, a thick carpet of decaying leaves swallowing the sound of their progress. After 10 minutes of silent, grueling trekking, the trees thinned into a hidden clearing. Mark stopped, reaching into a hidden pocket of his waxed jacket. He pulled out a bundle of leather-bound deeds, the edges scorched and brittle. "These shouldn't exist," he whispered, sliding the heavy paper toward her. Sarah's eyes scanned the flowing, elegant script. The Vance name repeated, generation after generation, a relentless anchor of history into this shadowed earth. The paper felt unnaturally cold, vibrating with a truth she couldn't outrun. She was 4,115 entries into her internal apology log. But for this, for her own existence, she didn't know how to say sorry. They moved deeper into the thicket, the silence of the woods becoming a heavy, physical weight. Mark led the way with a strange, practiced confidence, his middle finger occasionally sliding his thick-rimmed glasses back up the bridge of his nose. He stopped at a small rise where the earth seemed to have been churned and resettled. "Look at the boundaries," Mark said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hum. He spread the deeds over a flat, moss-covered stone. The Vance family didn't just own the land. They owned the history of everyone on it. These documents show a continuous line of occupation that the county records lost back in the 50s. Sarah ran her hand over the moss, the dampness seeping into her skin. She was comparing the digital map on her phone, the one she'd meticulously synced with her GPS, to the physical landmarks. The way the creek bent, the specific positioning of 3 ancient oaks. It was all there. The HeritageLink results hadn't been a fluke. The 100% match to a woman who supposedly died in 1890 was becoming a physical reality. "I'm sorry," Sarah whispered, the numbers clicking in her head. 4,116. "I'm sorry if I'm being slow. It's just, the data says one thing, but seeing the actual stone, the actual borders, it creates a cognitive dissonance." Mark reached into his pocket and pulled out a handful of sunflower seeds. Crack crunch. He chewed the shell, the sound sharp as a snapping bone in the quiet woods. "Data doesn't lie, Sarah. People do. The Vances have been lying for a century." The mood shifted instantly. The sound of a high-revving engine tore through the peaceful dampness of the forest. It was a low, predatory growl that didn't belong in a nature preserve. Sarah turned her head toward the sound, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Mark?" she gasped. A black SUV, its windows tinted to a void-like darkness, tore through the brush behind them. It wasn't following the road. It was creating its own path, crushing saplings and churning the mud into a violent spray. Before Sarah could scream, the vehicle lunged forward. The impact was a deafening roar of twisting metal and shattering glass. The SUV rammed their parked rental car, sending it spinning into a deep, waterlogged ditch. Sarah was thrown to the ground, the wind knocked out of her as her shoulder hit a tree root. The air was suddenly filled with the smell of gasoline and scorched rubber. A man jumped from the SUV, his face obscured by a dark tactical mask. He didn't hesitate. He lunged for Sarah, his gloved hand reaching for her throat. "No, I'm sorry," Sarah shrieked. 4,117. But her survival instinct overrode her compulsion. As he grabbed her arm, she swung her heavy, ruggedized laptop with both hands. The corner of the metal casing caught the assailant's hand with a sickening thud. He cried out, pulling back as his fingers blossomed with dark blood. Sarah didn't wait. She scrambled backward, her fingers brushing against something cold on the ground near the man's feet. He had dropped something in the struggle. She snatched it up, a plastic card, and bolted into the brush, following Mark, who was already disappearing into the green gloom. The SUV's engine roared again, but the dense trees acted as a cage, preventing the vehicle from pursuing them further into the heart of the estate. They ran until their lungs burned, the cold air carving through Sarah's chest. Finally, the trees broke, and the Vance manor loomed ahead. It was a sprawling, Victorian nightmare of gray stone and pointed gables, tucked away like a secret the world had forgotten. As they stumbled toward the heavy oak doors, the massive entrance swung open. An old man stood there, his skin so pale it looked translucent, like fine china. His hands were tucked under his armpits, trembling visibly. This was Arthur Vance. "You're here?" he whispered, his voice cracking. He lunged forward, not with violence, but with a desperate, weeping embrace that smelled of lavender and old, stagnant air. "Sarah, my dear, sweet Sarah. I've been waiting. I've been counting the days. You have to save us. You're the only one who can stop the cycle." Sarah stood frozen, her mind racing. She looked down at the plastic card she had snatched from the attacker. It wasn't a credit card. It was a high-tech security key, embossed with a sleek, modern logo. Vance Genomics. This wasn't a family haunting. It was a laboratory. "I'm sorry," she stammered, her voice trembling as she tried to pull away from the old man's grip. 4,118. "I don't understand. Who was that in the woods? Why are they trying to hurt me?" Arthur pulled back, his eyes darting to the corners of the porch as if the very shadows were listening. "The family. They don't want a savior. They want a vessel. But you, You have the spark. Please, come inside. It's not safe out here. The walls have ears, but the basement has teeth. The heavy doors groaned shut behind them, the sound of the iron bolts sliding into place echoing through the cavernous foyer like a guillotine blade falling. The air inside the manor was thick, cloying with the scent of lavender so strong it felt like a film on Sarah's tongue. Arthur didn't lead them to a parlor or a sitting room. Instead, he moved with a frantic, limping gait toward the grand staircase. 1, 2, 3, he muttered, his voice a shaky drone. He tapped each step with his toe before planting his weight. Arthur, we need to call the police, Mark said, his voice tight. He stepped toward a mahogany side table where a vintage rotary phone sat. He lifted the receiver, but his face went pale. He held it out so Sarah could hear. Silence, not even a dial tone, just the hollow, empty sound of a dead line. Sarah followed the cord down to the baseboard. The wire hadn't been pulled, it had been sliced clean with a pair of sharp blades. The gates are locked too, Arthur said, reaching the 24th step and exhaling a long, shuddering breath. The perimeter is sealed. It's for your protection, Elizabeth says. She doesn't want the outside world to interrupt the homecoming. Sarah felt the walls closing in. She looked at the ornate grandfather clocks lining the hallway. There were dozens of them, their pendulums swinging in perfect, haunting synchronization. Tick, tock, tick, tock. But when she looked closer, her blood ran cold. The clocks had no hands, no numbers, just blank white faces staring back at her like sightless eyes. I'm sorry, she whispered to the empty hallway. 4119. I think I've made a terrible mistake coming here. She turned to find a bathroom, needing a moment to splash cold water on her face and stop the world from spinning. She wandered into the grand dining hall, the floorboards groaning under her weight. The room was dominated by a massive fireplace and a series of oil paintings that stretched toward the vaulted ceiling. She stopped dead. Her breath caught in her throat. There, hanging in the center of the wall, was a portrait in a heavy, gilded frame. The brass plate at the bottom read, Eleanor Vance, 1885. The woman in the painting wasn't just a relative. She was a twin. The same sharp, observant eyes. The same rigid posture. The same way the elbows were tucked tight against the ribs. Eleanor Vance was wearing a high-collared black dress, her hair pinned up in a style that was a century out of date. But the face was Sarah's. A sharp beep from her wrist made her flinch. She looked down at her digital watch. The screen was flickering, the liquid crystal bleeding at the edges. The numbers were spinning, not forward but backward. 12:01, 12:00, 11:59. The speed of the countdown increased, the rhythmic chirp of the watch accelerating until it matched the frantic thudding of her heart. It's starting, a voice whispered. Sarah spun around, but the dining hall was empty. The voice hadn't come from the room. It had come from inside her own head, a low, melodic hum that sounded like a funeral dirge. Sarah backed away from the portrait, her heels clicking on the hardwood. She needed to find Mark. She needed to find a way out. She ran toward the back of the house, passing through a sunroom that opened into a massive, sprawling hedge maze. The green walls of the maze were 10 feet high, thick and impenetrable. As she reached the glass doors, a movement caught her eye. A man was standing in the center of the maze, a gardener in heavy canvas overalls. But he wasn't holding shears. He was cradling a long, matte black rifle with a pressurized canister attached to the side. He spotted her. With a mechanical, practiced motion, he raised the rifle. Pfft! A small feathered dart hissed through the air, shattering the glass pane inches from Sarah's head. She dove to the floor, the shards of glass raining down on her like frozen sparks. "Help!" she screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the heavy velvet curtains of the manor. She scrambled into the kitchen, her lungs burning. The gardener was coming. She could hear his heavy boots crunching on the glass. She looked for a place to hide, her eyes darting across the industrial-sized stoves and hanging copper pots. There, a small wooden door set into the wall. A dumbwaiter. She lunged for it, shoving her body into the cramped, dark space. She pulled the rope with everything she had, the wooden box jerking upward just as the kitchen door kicked open. The dumbwaiter groaned, the old ropes fraying and snapping. She ascended into the darkness, the rough wood scraping against her sides. A sharp pain flared in her chest as the box bucked against the shaft, slamming her ribs into the frame. She tumbled out onto the third floor, gasping for air, clutching her side. Every breath felt like a hot needle being driven into her lungs. "Sarah!" Mark appeared at the end of the hallway, his face a mask of concern. He ran to her, helping her to her feet. "I heard the glass break. What happened?" "The gardener. He has a gun." Sarah wheezed. "Mark, we have to go. Now." Mark didn't move toward the stairs. Instead, he led her into a small, dusty library. He sat her down in a leather chair and slid his glasses up his nose. Crack, crunch. He popped a sunflower seed into his mouth, his jaw working rhythmically. "I have to tell you something, Sarah," he said, his voice flat and devoid of its earlier warmth. "I wasn't entirely honest about why I helped you, about—" Sarah looked up, her eyes widening. "What do you mean?" "I'm not a librarian," Mark said. "I was a senior geneticist at the university. They kicked me out. Called my work monstrous because I wanted to see how far the blood could go. I've been tracking the Vance line for 12 years. I knew you'd show up on HeritageLink eventually. I made sure of it." He leaned in close, his breath smelling of salt and decay. "The Vances found a way to bridge the gap, Sarah. It's not a ghost story. It's biology. They use a specific sequence, a biological overwrite, to fold the consciousness of the dead into the living. You aren't just a descendant. You're a biological hard drive that's been formatted for Eleanor." Sarah felt the world tilt. "I'm sorry," she whispered. 4,120. "I don't understand. I'm a person. I'm not a vessel." "The Vances don't see people," Mark said, his eyes locking onto hers with a terrifying intensity. "They see legacy, and I need to see if it works. If I help them finish this, I get my lab back. I get my life back." Sarah's hand went to her pocket, feeling the corporate key card she'd stolen. Mark didn't know she had it. He thought she was just a scared girl with a spreadsheet. "I have to go to the bathroom," she said, her voice trembling. "Don't be long," Mark replied, the cracking of his seeds getting faster, more aggressive. Crack, crack, crunch. She slipped out of the library and moved toward the center of the house. She knew how systems worked. If this was a corporate operation, there had to be a hub. She found a heavy, reinforced door in the sub-basement, the lock glowing with a soft, red light. She swiped the keycard. Chirp. The light turned green. The room inside was freezing, filled with the low hum of cooling fans and the smell of ozone. Racks of blinking lights lined the walls. This was the manor's internal server. Sarah sat at the terminal, her fingers flying across the keys. She didn't look for files. She looked for patterns. She found the host directory. A list of names, hundreds of them, all linked to HeritageLink. The website wasn't a genealogy tool. It was a dragnet, a way to scan the world's DNA for the perfect matches. And at the top of the list, highlighted in gold, was her own name. "I'm sorry," she muttered, 4,121, as she began to bypass the security layers. "I'm sorry, but I'm taking this whole thing down." She spotted a satellite uplink icon on the corner of the screen. If she could get to the roof, she could realign the physical dish and broadcast the entire directory to the FBI's tip line. It was her only chance. Subverted beat 2.6. Sarah climbed through a cramped attic window, her boots slipping on the rain-slicked slate of the manor's roof. The storm had returned with a vengeance, the wind whipping her hair across her face like stinging lashes. Thunder rumbled in the distance, a low, guttural warning that vibrated in her very marrow. Below her, the ground was a jagged abyss of shadows and sharp rocks. She saw the satellite dish, a sleek, white bowl perched precariously on the edge of the highest gable. It was her lighthouse, her one chance to signal for rescue. She crawled toward it, her fingers raw and bleeding from gripping the cold stone. She reached the base of the dish, her tablet connected to the maintenance port via a short cable. "Come on," she hissed, her eyes fixed on the signal strength bar. Je pas 110 si je pas 110. The logic was sound. The Vance family relied on secrecy and their vast wealth to hide their crimes. By broadcasting the raw data of their experiments, the DNA maps, the vessel lists, the corporate ties, she would make them too visible to exist. The authorities would have to intervene. The world would see the monster behind the curtain. She felt a surge of genuine hope, a warmth in her chest that defied the freezing rain. She was going to win. She was going to be the one who finally said no without apologizing. The bar hit 95%. "Almost there," she whispered, a smile tugging at her lips. 98%, 99%, upload complete. A green checkmark flashed on her screen. Sarah let out a sob of relief, her shoulders dropping for the first time in days. She leaned back against the wet chimney, closing her eyes. The data was out there. The truth was screaming across the sky. She had done it. She was safe. She watched the tablet for a confirmation of receipt from the federal server. A small window popped up. Receipt acknowledged. But something was wrong. The logo on the receipt wasn't the FBI's. It was a stylized V, entwined with a double helix. Sarah's heart skipped. She tapped the screen, her fingers shaking. The broadcast hadn't gone to the authorities. The uplink was a closed loop. The manor's network was designed to catch any outgoing signal and reroute it to a private, off-site server owned by the Vance family. She hadn't exposed them. She had just handed them a neat, organized package of all the evidence she had gathered against them. She had told them exactly what she knew and how she had found it. A shadow fell over her. She looked up to see Robert Sterling, the family physician, standing on the widow's walk above her. He was impeccably groomed, even in the rain, his silver hair perfectly in place. He was slowly, methodically straightening his silk tie. "Shh, shh, shh. Thank you for the data audit, Sarah," he said, his voice a flat, emotionless drone. "You found 2 corrupted files in the 1892 archive that we hadn't noticed. Your efficiency is truly remarkable." Sarah tried to scramble away, but her foot slipped on the wet slate. She slid toward the edge of the roof, her fingers clawing at the air. Sterling didn't reach out to help her. He just watched with cold, clinical interest. "The broadcast you just sent triggered the final synchronization protocol." Sterling continued. "By accessing the core, you've initiated the handshake. You've given Eleanor the keys to the house. Sarah's world went black as a bolt of lightning illuminated the sky, and she felt her grip finally fail. Sarah woke up in a room that smelled of dried roses and old dust. The bed beneath her was soft, covered in heavy silk sheets that felt like a shroud. She tried to move her arms, but they felt heavy, as if her bones had been replaced with lead. She looked down. She wasn't wearing her jeans and flannel shirt. She was dressed in a heavy, black Victorian morning gown, the lace collar tight against her throat, choking her. The fabric was stiff, smelling of cedar and mothballs. She looked toward the fireplace. Her modern clothes, her bag, and her tablet were a heap of white ash in the grate, the orange embers glowing like dying eyes. A soft hiss caught her attention. Small brass vents near the ceiling were emitting a faint, sweet-smelling pink gas. The scent was cloying, like overripe peaches. As she inhaled, the room began to blur. The edges of her vision softened, and a strange, terrifying sense of peace began to wash over her. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice sounding like it belonged to someone else. 4122. "I'm so sorry." "Don't be sorry, dear," a voice said. Dr. Sterling was standing in the corner of the room, holding a silver tray with a single glass of water. He walked toward her, his posture rigid. "The pheromones will help with the transition. They lower the noise of the modern ego. It makes the integration much less messy." Sarah tried to sit up, her ribs screaming in protest. "The data, I sent it." "Yes," Sterling said, his voice a flat line. "You sent it to our primary archive in Zurich. It was a very helpful backup. Now please, drink. The lunar solstice is in 2 hours, and we have much work to do." Sarah lunged for the glass, but not to drink. She swung her arm, knocking the tray from his hands. The glass shattered on the floor. She scrambled off the bed, her legs buckling. She saw a heavy brass fountain pen on the nightstand. She snatched it up, her fingers gripping the cold metal. Sterling stepped toward her, his face showing no emotion. Sarah didn't think. She drove the nib of the pen into the side of his neck. He didn't scream. He just gasped, a wet gurgling sound escaping his throat as dark blood began to stain his white lab coat. He reached for his neck, his fingers fumbling with his tie. "Shh, shh." Sarah bolted for the door. She ran through the hallways, her heavy dress dragging behind her like a chain. She needed to find Mark. He was the only one who knew the science. Maybe he could stop it. She found him in the foyer, standing by the front doors. He was holding a small black device that looked like a remote control. "Mark, help me," Sarah cried, clutching her side. "I stabbed Sterling. We have to get out." Mark looked at her, then looked at the blood on her hands. He didn't move toward her. He didn't open the door. He simply slid his glasses up his nose and sighed. "I'm sorry, Sarah," he said. And for the first time, he didn't sound sorry at all. "But the experiment requires a controlled environment, and you've been very difficult to control." He raised the device and pressed a button. A sharp, high-pitched whine filled the air. Sarah's legs gave out. It wasn't pain. It was as if the connection between her brain and her muscles had been severed. She collapsed onto the cold marble floor, her cheek pressed against the stone. 2 guards in tactical gear stepped out from the shadows behind the staircase. They didn't look like family servants. They looked like mercenaries. "Take her down to the lab," Mark said, turning away to crack another sunflower seed. "And tell Elizabeth the vessel is ready for the needle." Sarah felt herself being lifted, her body a useless weight. She was carried toward the library, where a shelf of books swung open to reveal a sleek, stainless steel elevator. The descent was silent, the only sound the rhythmic thudding of her own heart, a heart that didn't feel like it belonged to her anymore. The elevator doors opened into a world of white light and cold steel. The subterranean laboratory was a cathedral of clinical horror. In the center of the room stood a rusted, Victorian-era iron operating table, surrounded by glowing screens and robotic arms. Aunt Elizabeth was there, her gray eyes cold as she watched Sarah being strapped down. She leaned over Sarah, her heavy jewelry clinking like bells. She reached out and stroked Sarah's cheek with a motherly tenderness that made Sarah want to vomit. "You have such lovely bone structure, darling," Elizabeth whispered. "Eleanor will be so pleased to have it back." She pulled a small syringe from her pocket, the liquid inside a shimmering, iridescent blue. "This will help you let go. The eye is such a heavy burden, isn't it? Let Eleanor carry it for you." She jammed the needle into Sarah's neck. The world dissolved. Sarah was no longer in the lab. She was in a dark, cold place, the smell of wet earth filling her nose. She could hear music. A slow, mournful funeral dirge played on a wheezing organ. "Who's there?" Sarah cried out in the darkness of her own mind. "I am the one who escaped the grave," a voice replied, dropping an octave, becoming melodic and ancient. "And I am so hungry for the sun." Sarah felt a cold hand wrap around her soul. She tried to pull away, but the voice was everywhere. It was in her memories of Chicago, in the spreadsheets she'd built, in the 4,122 apologies she'd logged. Eleanor was eating them, one by one, erasing the life of Sarah Johnson to make room for her own. "I'm sorry," Sarah whispered. But the numbers were gone. There was no more counting. There was only the humming. Subverted beat 4.1. Sarah lay on the iron table, her vision a fractured kaleidoscope of fluorescent lights and Elizabeth's cold smile. The blue liquid was a fire in her veins, but a small, stubborn part of her, the part that analyzed data, the part that looked for the one error in a million, was still clicking. She looked at the ceiling. A rhythmic strobe was pulsing in the corner. 4 seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4. She realized the lab systems weren't separate from the house. They were integrated. The cooling for the CRISPR processors, the ventilation for the pheromones, the security for the elevator. It was all one network. And she had her phone. It was still in the hidden pocket of her Victorian dress, the one the guards hadn't checked because they thought she was just a vessel. She couldn't move her arms, but her chin was resting against her collar. She whispered the voice command she'd programmed months ago for her smart home in Chicago, a failsafe for when she felt overwhelmed. System override, thermal purge. The logic was perfect. By triggering a runaway in the cooling system, she would force the processors to overheat and shut down, killing the power to the entire lab and the restraints. In the chaos, she would slip away. It was a brilliant, technical solution to a biological problem. She felt a surge of triumph. She was outsmarting them again. The lab screens suddenly turned a violent red. Warning, cooling failure, critical overheat. "What are you doing?" Sterling screamed, clutching his bandaged neck. The first explosion wasn't a shutdown. It was the liquid nitrogen tanks in the wall. They didn't just stop. They ruptured. A wall of freezing white mist and jagged shrapnel tore through the room. The iron restraints on the table snapped as the metal became brittle and shattered. Sarah rolled off the table, the freezing air burning her skin. She was free, but the lab was a death trap. The fire she'd hoped for wasn't a controlled burn, it was a chemical inferno. The floor was slick with blue fluid and blood. She scrambled toward the elevator, but the shaft was a chimney of black smoke. She had to climb. She found a maintenance ladder, her hands freezing to the rungs, pulling herself up as the floor below her vanished in a roar of orange flame and screaming metal. She reached the surface, stumbling out of the library as the manor groaned, its foundations melting. She ran for the front doors, the heat at her back a physical lash. She burst through the oak doors just as the grand staircase collapsed into the cellar. She didn't stop until she reached the edge of the woods. She turned back to see the Vance Manor, the gray stone nightmare, transformed into a skeletal ruin of fire. The legacy was burning. The Vances, the lab, the corporate secrets, all of it was being turned into ash. She sat in the mud, watching the sun rise over the smoking remains. She thought of Arthur, the man who had been waiting for a savior. He hadn't been a villain. He had been a shell, a man whose eye had been eaten away until there was nothing left but the counting. "I'm sorry, Arthur," she whispered. There were no numbers left to track. 6 months later. The Arizona desert was a vast, empty horizon of red rock and shimmering heat. Sarah sat on the porch of a small, secluded ranch house, the dry wind whistling through the scrub like a human sigh. She had no phone, no computer, no DNA tests, just a stack of leather-bound journals and a box of pens. She spent her days writing. She wrote down every memory she could find. The smell of her mother's perfume, the feeling of the plastic on her furniture in Chicago, the taste of a bad cup of coffee in the rain. She was anchoring herself, building a wall of words against the silence. She felt safe. The Vances were gone. The fire had taken everything. She picked up her pen to start a new page. "Today the sun is hot," she began to write. She stopped. She looked at the paper. The words were there, but the handwriting. It wasn't her cramped, modern script. It was a perfect, elegant copperplate, the letters swirling with a 19th century grace. She tried again. "My name is Sarah Johnson." The pen moved of its own accord. The S was a beautiful, ornate loop. The J was a masterpiece of calligraphy. Sarah stared at her hand, her breath hitching in her throat. She felt a vibration in her chest, a low, rhythmic hum that she couldn't stop. The funeral dirge. She looked into the window glass, her reflection staring back at her. Her eyes were her own, but the expression, the way the corners of her mouth curled into a small, poetic smile. "I'm still here, Sarah," a voice whispered from inside her own mind, dropping an octave. "And the desert is so much warmer than the grave." Sarah picked up the pen again. She didn't try to fight it this time. She just watched as her hand wrote the same sentence over and over again in that beautiful, terrifying script. "I am not sorry. I am not sorry. I am not sorry." The passenger had arrived, and she was never going to leave. The end. Do not proceed past this point.